So this class is dedicated to a pastor named Jonathan Wilson. He was a missionary to Japan. He had been a missionary in Japan for 30 years. He married a Japanese lady, and he lived there during the time when they had a great tsunami many years ago now that wrecked the area in Japan called Fukushima and destroyed many homes and villages, and some children in Japan had lost everything. They lost their parents, they became orphans, and he was used of God to set up a camp for these children so that they could have what they called psychological first aid. And Mr. Wilson had been a pastor for many years, and as he helped manage all the resources that people around the world began to send to Japan to help with this disaster, they asked him to help with the children. And the children's problem was they were going back to school, but they couldn't think about their lessons, they couldn't study, they couldn't learn. They were in class, but something was wrong. And so they worked with professional psychiatrists, psychologists to develop a 5-day camp for the kids. And they took the kids into the camp, and they had games and songs and crafts and snacks and stories, and they would tell the children a story about these little cute animals like penguins and polar bears that were the characters, and in the story they would go through trauma. And so the children would begin to identify with the characters in the story that were going through trauma just like they had from the tsunami. And so through this VBS style camp, at the end of 5 days, over 95% of the children would snap out of their trauma mindset, and they would go back to school, and they'd be able to think, and they'd be able to learn again. So we want to explain, what was going on in this camp, what was going on in the children's minds, why was this simple little camp able to help these children. And so working with these camps, where they were called Operation Safe or OpSafe camps, they were used in the Philippines where there was a lot of war, they were used in China when there was earthquakes, and they were found to be very effective at helping children recover. So they call it psychological first aid. So we're all familiar with when somebody gets a cut or an injury, any one of us can help them wash it, disinfect it, put on a Band-Aid, and we're not professional doctors or medical people, we're not nurses, but any of us can help another person until they can get to professional care. And so if they need that professional care, we can put them in a car and take them to the hospital, but we don't do nothing when somebody has an accident or an injury. We do what we can. And so in the same way, we don't need to be professional psychologists or psychiatrists or have training like that to be able to help each other with our psychological first aid. So psychological first aid is basically putting a Band-Aid on a child's heart rather than on their hand or their body somewhere. And so these are the things that we began to learn working with Jonathan, and we ran these camps in Mongolia with children, and we didn't have earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes and wars in Mongolia, but we had other kinds of trauma. The children would get lost, or they would a dog would bite them, or they would be bullied at school, or they would be in homes where there was domestic violence or abuse. So we learned that some children experience these acute traumas of some natural disaster, and some children experience everyday trauma just with their normal life. So what are we going to do with this information today? Well, we want to think about how trauma affects our children and how we can help them through life when they're going through trauma. So some of the things we're going to talk about might kind of seem a little bit hard-hitting, but sometimes that's what we need to address an issue. And this issue of being approachable as parents does need to be addressed. We don't want to live a life where we've raised our children and they've never been able to come to us and talk to us and open up to us and get the help that they need. But that can happen. A lot of children are raised that way. So the role of the parent should be to become a safe person, that the child feels safe with, the child feels comfortable with. When they have a trouble or a trauma, they can go to the parent. And a lot of times this happens when children are little. They fall down, they skin their knee, any bee sting, whatever, they run to the parents. But as they get older, these barriers can start to come in where they don't come, and they're having issues a lot bigger than, dog bites and bee stings and things. So what can we do about this, and how can we see that this is something God encourages us in the Scriptures? So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is not easily provoked. So when we love our children, We don't want to be easily provoked. Even if they've done something wrong or sinful, something that would tend to make us angry, we still want to say, well, if I love my child, I don't want to be easily provoked. James says here in a different way, he says, easy to be entreated. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 4:13, it's better to be a wise child than an old foolish king who will no longer be admonished. So we don't want to be, as parents, we don't want to be like the old foolish king and nobody can tell us anything, but we want to be like the wise child. And we want to be able to still keep learning, even though we're adults and we have children of our own. God told Moses in Exodus 34, when he revealed himself to him, he said, I'm long-suffering. Some versions translate that slow to anger. So this is the model that God gives us in the scriptures for how we should be able to be perceived by our children. We should be perceived as easy to be entreated, approachable, loving, not easily provoked, slow to anger. And are we that way? Are we modeling this approachability for our children? And there's a lot at stake here, and we're going to discuss exactly what's at stake in a moment. The topic of becoming approachable parents is something that we need to get a grip on for long-term parenting, and it involves psychological understanding of human trauma. So with all the challenges we have in the modern world facing us as parents, and all the flood of different issues coming at our children, we can't afford not to understand what's hitting our children. What are they facing, and how are they dealing with life when it comes to them in a traumatic way? Some Christians have a subconscious prejudice against psychology, and this is common, and I've had it. Just kind of throw away the whole idea of psychology and psychiatry and never even consider that there might be some things there that are good and useful. Sometimes psychological training, philosophy in college and whatever, you'll come across grossly unbiblical ideas and concepts for treatment and whatever. And those things we can identify as wrong, but sometimes the reaction is to throw out all of that together when there are good things there as well. So learning how the mind and the human body and brain deals with trauma and the psychological basis for it really helped me to develop ministry to children in Mongolia, and I want to share some of those things with you. We don't want to reject psychology and psychiatry out of ignorance as believers, but we're told to prove all things and hold on to those things that are good, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. So I've found some really good things that are based in psychology, and I've proven that those things are good and they're biblical. So we're going to consider psychology in our presentation today as Bible-informed exploration of how God designed the human brain and mind. So we're starting from the assumption that God designed the brain, He designed the mind, it works in a certain way. The Bible's going to reference that. Even though the Bible is not a psychology textbook, it is going to talk about the human mind and all the aspects of how humans relate to trauma and life. Is going to be in the Bible because we're dealing with God who designed it. So we don't need to flee from the topic of psychology and psychiatry in fear, because the human mind is God's domain. He created it. And all the scientists in the world with their millions of dollars in universities and programs and research, all they can do is end up discovering how God made the mind to work. And since God already knew that, a lot of the stuff we get in the Bible is already tailored to the human condition and the human mind, without understanding the intricacies from a psychological perspective. But the psychology does help us explore this area of trauma. So trauma means, for our discussion today, the adverse events that happen to us in life and how we respond to them. So it's not what happens to me, but it's how I respond to what happens to me that often constitutes trauma. And so becoming an approachable parent involves becoming trauma informed. We need to know what it is and how it works and when our child's going through it. So we're going to start that trauma information process today in this lesson. And trauma is basically very well understood from a scientific perspective. When humans are confronted with danger, they have a survival part of their brain that takes over. And this survival part of the brain is only concerned about staying alive. And so there are three basic tools that humans have when they are confronted with danger, they have three things they can do. They can flee, they can run away. It's called flight, a flight reflex. So, for instance, animals also have these same instincts. Horses. So a horse is made by God so that whenever he faces danger, he runs away as fast as he can, and when he gets a couple miles away, he looks back to see what was going to get him. He doesn't freeze like maybe a rabbit would. A rabbit senses danger, and the rabbit will freeze. This is another thing we can do. So freezing has to do with hiding. This is manifest in humans through lying, where we don't want to be caught or discovered. We sense a danger, so our freezing mechanism sometimes is manifested in hiding the truth and taking cover. And then another one is fight. So, for instance, a predator like a lion or whatever, if he's confronted with danger, he's not going to back down. His survival brain is going to kick into fight mode. So humans can do any of these three as we're confronted with danger. So what they find when they're dealing with kids that are going through these trauma situations like the tsunami or whatever, when they go back to school, because their mind has not been released from this traumatic event, that's what the kids end up doing at school. More fighting, more fleeing, more wanting to go home, not wanting to be at school, or this freezing fight, flight, or freeze reflex is the only behaviors that the children are manifesting in school after an earthquake or tsunami, because their brain is still replaying this memory of this trauma. So how do you get the kid to snap out of that, and so that they can go back to thinking again? Because what happens is the part of our brain that wants to survive has dominion over the part of our brain that wants to think and reason. So education is thinking and reasoning, and when kids go to school and they've been through a trauma, the survival brain is still in full dominion over the cognitive thinking part of the brain, and the teachers are frustrated. Yes, we have the kids back in school, but it's not doing them any good. They can't think. And so what happens is when your survival mind is in gear, for instance, a kid who's in this tsunami crisis, all of the senses of his body that were active at that time became much more sensory. He was much more aware of how things sounded, how things looked, how things felt. And so because everything in his body, he gets an adrenaline rush, and he's getting ready to survive. And so all of those sensations etch into his memory. So when he's going back to school, he's thinking of that, there's basically what we see on TV in a sports game, instant replay. So his brain is instantly replaying, and he's not just getting a video in his mind, he's getting the smells, the sounds, the feelings, everything that he sensory experienced in that trauma is hitting him again. And so he's sitting there trying to do math, and his brain's back in this trauma that he experienced. And so the children's brains would stay stuck in that instant replay mode and endlessly reviewing this. And so these children needed something to stop that and get them back to where their survival brain was back in the back seat and their thinking brain had dominion again, and they could do their schoolwork. So we're going to explain what this psychological first aid is in a moment. Most of these children, when they went through these VBS style camps, they would be able to go back to school and everything would be fine. There was a certain number of the kids, they would have what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And this is a very well-known, well-studied condition. When people go to fight in a war, soldiers, whatever, they come back after their term, they can have this post-traumatic stress disorder, and they'll need professional help. So that would be like a child whose accident is so bad that you can't really help them. You can just do something temporary to get them to a professional. So in the camps, we were trained that if you find a child who has a serious issue, you just report that to the camp directors. They can help that child get professional care. But for the majority, most of the children, just doing the psychological first aid was all they needed. So before we look into what that is exactly, we want to take this idea of trauma and we want to think about it from the Bible. So if you're using a King James Bible, you're going to find all these words in the Bible, but you're not going to find the word trauma. That's not going to be a part of that vocabulary. But the things that relate to that, you're going to find terms like trouble, affliction, adversity, sorrow, grief, distress, horror, terror, oppression, terrible. So we got plenty of vocabulary in the Bible that's dealing with trauma. And the Bible doesn't hide from us traumatic events like famines, wars, starvation, Joseph being sold by his brothers into Egypt. You know, traumatic events are recorded and people's responses are recorded. And so trauma is all through the Bible, and all kinds of people experienced it. And so the vocabulary of the Bible supports the notion that life is traumatic for people, and that trauma is normal for most people. And so we defined trauma as two types. One was acute and one was chronic. So if you've got people going through a war or some natural disaster, that would be called acute trauma. It's sudden, it's out of the ordinary. Chronic trauma would be what you experience every day. So children are going to be exposed to chronic trauma no matter where they live in the world, and they could be exposed to acute trauma. But the same thing works. The same type of camps worked in Mongolia just as well for kids who were experiencing chronic trauma as it did for kids in Japan who experienced the acute trauma. So, you know, children in Mongolia were experiencing being bullied, abused, accidents, relationship breakdowns, anger, like I said, dog bites, getting lost, whatever. Another thing we found that was chronic trauma for children in Mongolia was when their parents were absorbed with devices all the time, and the children were never able to get eye contact and have their parents be fully present with them. So a lot of kids were being traumatized by basically the absence of a relationship with their parents, even though they're in the same house, because the parents were full-time on their devices. So that was a surprising one, but it's a symptom of our modern culture, and any kid can be having that in Western culture as well. So some of the maxims that we pulled out of this is everybody experiences life as trauma. All kids experience trauma. And the reason this is true is because trauma is relative. So if you had the example of a child in New York, let's say New York City, kid's in his apartment, he's with his Xbox, he's playing his games. Suddenly, for whatever reason, his Xbox doesn't work. That New York City kid has a house full of food, he's got clothes, he's got shelter, he's got protection, he's got his parents, he's got everything, but he's having trauma, serious, real trauma in his mind because his Xbox isn't working. Well, if you take a kid over across the ocean in Syria who's lived through war and his apartment being bombed in the middle of the night and having to flee for his life, and he goes out in the morning with his little friends on the street and takes chunks of concrete and plays tanks and, you know, battles because that's what he sees all around him. The kid in Syria couldn't be traumatized by an Xbox breaking, you know, because he's already lived through way worse than that. But so for every child in the world, no matter what their experience is, your child, my child, your home, my home, whatever the condition, these children experience life as traumatic. And this is in spite of all of our attempts to prevent it. We can say, well, I'm not going to let my child experience any trauma. I don't want that for them. But in spite of what we do, that's still going to be their experience because it's relative to what their life is like. So we actually discovered that we're incapable of preventing trauma and adversity for our children. And I'll give you an example. When we were staying in South Korea in 2019, one of our friends there said, let me take you to an amusement park. So we went to the amusement park, and it was this chairlift, like a ski slope, but there was no ski slope. We would ride to the top of the mountain. We would get on these little carts, and we would ride down this road, and it was like a great big long, you know, sliding board, but we were on these little scooters. And so we went up 2 or 3 times and rode back down. And there were literally thousands of people standing in line for 2 hours waiting their turn to get on this little scooter thing and have fun going wee, wee, wee down the hill, you know. Well, in the meanwhile, we were reading in the newspaper that what was happening in North Korea. So in the South, you had wealth, and you had food, and you had affluence, and you had amusement parks. In the North, they didn't have enough food. So the government said, in order to produce enough fertilizer, to fertilize the fields, everybody has to donate their human waste every year, and we're going to collect so many kilograms per person. And if you don't give enough, you'll be penalized. So the North Koreans are trying to figure out how to meet their fertilizer quotas, which is human waste, and they were stealing from each other, trying to meet their quotas. So I'm like, I've got North Korea, hungry people, having trauma, and not having enough food. In the South, we're all lined up to play on the amusement park. You know, there was a stark contrast. So you would say to yourself, which people group was experiencing the worst trauma? The people that were hungry in the North or the people that were playing in the South? Well, we asked people who came from the North. We said, what was it like? You know, how did you survive? And they said, well, we all stuck together. We had community. We helped each other. And then these North Korean refugees were telling us, we can't believe what we see when we come to South Korea. We find beautiful young girls who are pretty, and they have clothes, and they have money, and they have the best phones, and they have the best makeup, and the best styles, and they kill themselves because they didn't pass their college exam, entrance exam, or they got a bad grade. And these North Korean refugees are saying, we're up here starving and going hungry, but not one of us ever thought of taking our own life. And we come to the South where everybody has plenty of food, and we see beautiful young people killing themselves. So in reality, which culture was experiencing more trauma? Because the ones in the North, they weren't killing themselves, but the young people in the South were tempted to commit suicide, and it's a huge problem. Huge problem in Japan, huge problem in Korea. So trauma's relative. It's relative to what you're going through. And the parents of the children in the South had succeeded in removing as much adversity from their children's lives as they could. They took away hunger, they took away, lack of education. The children had everything, but they were still traumatized by life to the point that they would kill themselves. So what we have to realize as parents is we're not responsible to take adversity away from our children's lives. We're responsible to help them walk through it. So if we view our role in that light, then we can accept that, yeah, my child, they're going to go through hard things. They're going to go through tough things. What my child goes through may be different from what your child goes through. They're still going to perceive it as traumatic and difficult, and they're going to need psychological first aid. So our responsibility is managing, not preventing. But how do we do that? Okay, so psychologists use a term nowadays to describe childhood trauma as adverse childhood events. So they call them ACEs. And if you're reading psychological books that have to do with teaching school or working with kids that have had abuse or whatever, you're gonna come across this term ACEs, and it's used so commonly you might not even have it explained what it means when you're reading something. ACEs, what's ACEs? Okay, ACE in that context means an adverse childhood event, an event that happens in the child's life that involves adversity. And so this adversity in the child's life has one of two potential outcomes. It can make the child weaker, or it can make the child stronger. And so they've discovered that trauma does not always result in ruining a child's life or making that child weaker or debilitated. It can have the effect of making the child stronger and more resilient and more able to overcome adversity. So what makes the difference between these two outcomes? We have a bad outcome, which we don't want, which is my child became weaker and debilitated, and then we have a strong outcome, which we do want, was I want my child to grow and mature and be able to overcome these things because their life is going to be filled with adversity. And so what they found is when a child has an adverse childhood event, it's like a ticking time bomb in the child's life. If they don't get help, when about 10 years later, they'll choose to have many different kinds of self-destructive behaviors involving alcohol, drugs, sex and pornography, addictions of all kinds, because they've never dealt with their trauma event. And so trying to self-medicate and self-comfort, they'll choose these things that aren't going to help them, but they're just trying to drown out the pain and the noise of what they're remembering and what happened. So these unresolved adverse childhood events can be the triggers that create a path of destruction in the child's life, or they can function as the same triggers that make that child rise up and overcome those things. And so this can explain why some people who are physically disabled end up accomplishing more in their life than people who are not physically disabled, because they go through this crisis at a younger age. They learn to have a different perspective on life, that, hey, it's going to be tough, and they rise up and they overcome that instead of letting it destroy them. So children, even disabled children, often will exhibit this spirit of overcoming that they've had to learn from the time they could move around or crawl or walk or whatever, and everybody's amazed. What, you climbed the mountain and you you did all these wonderful things? None of us did that. Yeah, because we were maybe more protected, more sheltered, and we didn't move into that better mindset that, yeah, something bad happened, but that doesn't have to be the end of me, or I don't have to give up. So let's talk about the one thing that makes the difference. Okay, so we have the two outcomes, the bad outcome and the good one. We have becoming weaker or becoming stronger. What makes the difference between a child going on one of those paths or the other? And they found out it's verbalization to a safe person. So basically, if the child can find a safe person that they can talk to about what happened, instead of going down the path of weakness and debilitation, they'll go on the path of getting stronger and becoming more resilient. So we call this verbalization to a safe person psychological first aid. And so the camps we ran with these kids in Mongolia, we'd have a 5-day camp. It was 3 hours a day, set up just like VBS for churches, because most of the churches are going to be running these camps and they know how to do VBS camps. They've had experience. And so you put the children in little groups called a crew of 5 or 6 children, and you put them with a crew leader. And they go through many things together. They eat together, they do crafts together, they do snacks together, they go to stories together. They're doing everything together, and they start bonding as a little group. And so the camp is set up and managed with different messages and with different themes, so that by the 3rd or 4th day, they've connected and they're kind of bonded. And then you start bringing in this thought to the child, what bad things happened to you, like happened to these little characters in the story, and do you want to talk about it, and do you want to tell about it? And so by the end of the camp, the kids are willing to open up normally and talk. You don't force them, you don't put pressure on them, but you just give them the opportunity to tell what bad, the animal in the story had this bad experience. What bad experience did you have? And then normally these kids will open up and talk and tell. And when they go through this with the acute trauma, with the earthquakes and tsunamis and whatever, that's all the children need. They're just able to verbalize what happened to them. And they found out that when a child gets the opportunity to verbalize to a safe person what happened to them, it turns off the video that keeps playing in their mind and the constant repetition of this memory that's just, they can't control it. And so, but as soon as, for some reason, when the human person with words, with their mouth out loud, says what happens to another person that they can trust, it moves into their psychological past. Now their brain gives them permission to begin forgetting about it. And so that memory becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. And so it's not constantly bothering the child. So until the mind is able to unburden itself through telling what happened, it's still subject to this endless replay, and it's stuck in this survival, fight, flight, or freeze mode. So for a student, a boy in school, he's going to act out more, he's going to fight more, he's going to, he's going to go through this process of exhibiting these behaviors. Then 10 years later, when he's a teenager and he's got a girlfriend now, he's going to be the same way. When he has trauma in his relations with his girlfriend, what is he going to do? He's going to fight, he's going to hit, or maybe he's going to be the type that lied or avoided, he's still stuck in this frame of mind. The only tools he knows with to deal with life is fight, flight, or freeze. And so it's important to get these children in a situation where they can say these things and tell what happened to them and get this trauma memory to stop playing as early as possible. And so this ties really closely into what's in the Bible. It talks in James about being quick to listen. And so it couldn't be more simple, it couldn't be more biblical, that all we need to do for these children is to be the safe person that they can tell their troubles to. A lot of parents do this, but a lot of parents also don't do this. A lot of parents never had anybody do that to them when they were a child. So they don't know the model. They've never seen it modeled. They've never seen it done. So they grow up and they parent children, but they're not having practical experience in doing this. So any person can give this psychological first aid to a child. And it's interesting that God says in James, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. That's just so powerful in the context of all this trauma. And somebody pointed out you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you talk. That's a good ratio. And somebody will say, yeah, but then I'll never get to say anything. What you find out is when you let the other person talk, they say a lot of the stuff you wanted to say anyway, so you don't have to say it. So it still works out okay. James 5:16 goes into this even deeper, and it says to us plainly, confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that you might be healed. So one another is mentioned twice here. This is not spending a lot of money to go to a professional psychologist or psychiatrist. It's just simply giving each other the opportunity to tell our troubles to one another and say, this is what happened to me, and the other person will show us some empathy. They'll sympathize with us and then pray for us, and we can experience healing. And this is not just talking about physical healing. Most people today recognize that a lot of physical illnesses come from mental conditions and attitudes such as unforgiveness, hatred, bitterness, and these kinds of things end up manifesting as physical diseases. So the healing that it's talking about here is a whole person healing, not just a physical disease, but our mental condition, which is often the root. So it's our duty as leaders of our homes, as parents, as taking roles in families, institutions, churches, to develop our listening skills. And so when I understood this, I told myself, well, let me go and take an online listening assessment and find out how good of a listener I am. So I just Googled it, pulled up a PDF, took my assessment, and got my score, and I was average. And the paper said, don't be discouraged, most people are average. This is a skill, like any other skill. If you want to be good at it, you got to work at it. So then I got the course on how to improve my listening skills. And it was great. It was wonderful. I learned a lot of things. And it's something I can go back and review, and then I can practice, and then I can go back and review, and I can see how I'm doing. So I believe what God's calling us to do, based on what we're reading in James, is to become experts, to become better than average, to become highly skilled at becoming listeners. Not just in our own home, but in the church and in the body of Christ. So it's almost like as Christians, God wants us to identify as listeners. That's who I am. That's what I do. That's how I help people. It's actually a therapeutic listening that we're doing for one another. And I've asked myself for years, how do I really help people, God? How do I really, really help people? And this is one of the things God's brought to me. If you really want to help people, then you need to become compassionate as a listener. And if I really want to help children, I need to become the safe person that they pick when they're ready to talk about what happened to them. So that's why we're asking the question as parents, are we the safe person for our child? Can they come to us at any time, tell us anything? Sometimes parents are in denial and say, well, my children don't have any trauma. My children have food, my children have clothes, my children have everything they need. No trauma in my kid's life. That would be in denial, because we all know we could go around the world, interview any adult and says, was your childhood traumatic? What things happened to you in your childhood that you are determined you will never let happen to your children? Well, everybody has something to say to that, right? And so the more adamantly we take the position, my children don't have any trauma, the more likely it is that we're going to be a source of trauma in their life. Okay, so it's time to throw that off and say, okay, let's just embrace this. My children have trauma. No matter, how much good I do in providing for them, they're still going to experience life in many ways as trauma. So there are two methods that we can use to resolve the trauma. One of those methods is trying to exempt our children from trauma. And the buzzword going around when I was in my younger years was sheltering. There was lots of homeschool conferences and people writing all these articles about sheltering your children and how much is too much, and well, my mother took the approach of sheltering to the max, on certain issues, and as we lived through that and came out on the other side and got into our own adult lives, we realized that whole sheltering thing was a catastrophe. It didn't work, it didn't help, it didn't produce good results. And so this idea that our job as parents is to remove trauma from our child's lives to the maximum extent possible, to the best of our ability, is not a healthy outlook. And I'll tell you a little story about a friend of mine who lived in China, and I'll call him Xiao Wang. Xiao Wang grew up during Mao's era as a little boy, and he would tell me how he loved his grandmother because they were hungry, and 40 to 50 million people starved to death under Mao's revolution. They sent the rice to Russia in trade for weapons, and the people were hungry, and it was part of Mao's program of totally reducing the country to nothing and then building back with a unified people. But Xiao Wang was a little boy at that time, and his grandmother would steal corn for him from the government corn patch, and he just loved his grandmother because she got him food, and he was hungry, and his grandmother was willing to go steal so that he could have corn, and he just grew up with this great affection for his grandmother, and he knew what hunger was. He knew what it was like to be hungry and to do without. So what do you think happened to Xiao Wang? He has a son, Wang Li, and Wang Li comes along, and Xiao Wang is determined that what happened to him in his childhood will never happen to his son. His son will never go hungry. And so he worked really hard. He became a carpenter, he became a builder, and he was one of my best friends. He would do a lot of building for me on the project that I was a part of, and he was successful. He became well off. He went from abject poverty with nothing to owning 2 apartments. And by the time his son was able to get married, he gave one of the apartments to his son. His son never had to work for anything. He never experienced hunger. He had all the food he could eat. And Xiao Wang felt like he was helping his son be exempt from hunger that he has experienced, that was a bad thing, and it wasn't good. Well, the way Wang Li turned out was he became spoiled. He had no appreciation for what his father worked for. When he got married, he took large amounts of his father's wealth and went traveling and spent it, and it was gone, and his father, what could he do? He had exempted his son from the experience of hunger, and his son had not matured in the same way that Xiao Wang had. Xiao Wang could have been wise enough to say, no, I need to let my child experience some hunger. It was good for me. Xiao Wang was a much better person, much more mature, much stronger, much healthier than he would have been if he had never experienced hunger. So the hunger is such a strong human lack, painful, that it can create this determination. My children will never experience this, and yet the result of those children is they don't turn out very well. They become weak and immature. And so what I'm suggesting is appropriate. Rather than exempting our children from exposure to adversity, is that we manage the exposure. So we purposely arrange things in such a way that our children get a chance to have some adversity and some trauma, not in a way that's going to destroy them or wreck their life, but in a way that we can stand beside them and help guide them as they go through that. So I'll give you an example. In China, my son Light was born, and I was so excited about having my little boy, and I went to town and I got him a hammer that was, he was still in diapers, and I got him a hammer that was a tack hammer, you know, and it wasn't this huge thing, because he would see my hammer and try to pick it up and pound with it, and it's like almost as big as his arm. So I got him this little one, and I got him some nails, and I got him some boards, and I just let him play with his hammer, and he'd see me pound nails, and he would try to pound nails. And my Chinese friends would come over, and they would come to me in great concern. Did you know your son has a hammer? And I was like, yeah, I gave it to him. They would never give their son a hammer. They wanted to, see, they're only going to have one child. So their level of intensity of protecting that child from harm is really high, because they don't want to lose that one child they're going to have. And so my hope was that my son would hit his finger with the hammer hard enough that he would gain some wisdom, so that when he's a teenager, he'll be cautious and not wreck his car. So I'm giving him a little bit of managed exposure to pain, so that And this is happening before he's 5 years old. So this is going to be hardwired into his brain. He's not even going to have to think about it. He's just going to become a cautious person because I've given him exposure to danger. And we did this with our children with germs and diseases. We never vaccinated our children for anything. We allowed them to be exposed to germs, and we allowed their natural immunity to develop. So we lived in China, which at the time, they cleaned it up a lot now, but at the time it was one of the dirtiest places you could ever imagine by American standards. And it was so much so that when you went to the market, you realized the people have no concept. They don't even have a file for germs and sanitation. Obviously they live as if those things don't exist. You know, human urine was just water and human waste was just dirt, and that's how they looked at it, because they had farmed with these, you know, human waste products as fertilizer for centuries. So, you know, for an American to be over there, and I had a mom that was a nurse, and she wouldn't even let us, you know, if she was putting beef in boxes to put in the freezer and a little bit dropped on the floor, we'd grab on it and try to eat it, and she wouldn't let us. You know, if it fell on the floor, well, I'm over there in the meat market, and it's like a total out of order by my mom's definition, and I'm like, why aren't these people all dead? Well, we found out there was reasons why. They consume a lot of alcohol, a lot of seaweed, a lot of ginger, a lot of hot peppers, and all those things kind of killing it off as it goes through. But we never took our children to the doctor. We never took them to the hospital. And the Chinese, what they would do, as soon as their children got a runny nose, a sniffle, cold, or whatever, they'd go to the hospital and they'd give them a drip IV. And you'd go to the hospital, these rooms full of children sitting around with drip IVs, because that's what the parents perceived as a standard of care for loving their child. Well, our children would get sick and they'd be having these fevers and pains and runny noses, and we had our program. We'd give them extra rest, extra music, extra love, extra quiet, extra water, extra nutrition, and then we'd just let their body take care of it. And they watched us, you know, nurse our children through all these things and never take them to get a drip IV. They thought we were bad. They thought we were, why would you let your child suffer through all that pain? And they couldn't understand our approach. But our approach was exposure to germs to build a lifelong immune system. And that has worked really well for our children. So, you know, their children would come over to play with my children. My children are going down to the creek and sitting in the mud puddles. And they're like, oh, there's germs in there. So, you know, we had this totally different worldview. But we want to dissolve this idea that it's our job to remove trauma for our child's life and never let them go through what we did. And, you know, we've all heard these stories about, well, I used to walk 5 miles to school for 3 feet of snow, and, you know, and I'll never let my children do that, you know. And I was talking to a man who I got to know a few months ago, and he was telling how hungry he was as a child. And he said, when I got married, I told my wife, we're having a warm house and plenty to eat. You know, he didn't want his child to experience cold and hunger. And so we've got to come to this conclusion that it's our job to walk with people through adversity, even our own children, to react responsibly, help them prevail over their adversity, and become stronger. So one of the problems is when we hear about trauma in a person's life, we automatically assume the direction that's going to go is to weakness. We assume that they're going to choose the weak path, that this is going to be catastrophic in their life, it's going to wreck everything, and we jump to this conclusion that the guaranteed outcome of major trauma in a person's life is that it destroys their life. But that's not the case. The other outcome can be just as possible. Incredible, amazing strength. And you read the letters to the churches that Jesus wrote in Revelation that John recorded. At the end of every letter, 7 letters, what does he say? Whoever overcomes will get this. And he's saying, I want you to overcome like I've overcome. Jesus is not in the business of taking adversity out of his disciples' lives. He's in the business of helping them overcome it, and he set the example. He's saying, I'm going to walk with you through this trauma. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. I'll be with you, but you're going to go through a lot of hard stuff. That's a real friend. And that's what we want to be for our children, not the people that are running around trying to guard them from every possible adverse thing, but the person that says, hey, no matter what happens to you, you can come to me and we can talk. And so one of the examples I want to give you, in the modern world, especially in the pro-life movement, a lot is said about laws against abortion. And one of these situations you get into in these discussions is, well, what about rape? So we have this question brought up. If a woman is raped and she conceives, of course, then it's justified. And most laws in America will go to that point and say, you know, we'll ban it except for these cases where there's a conception through rape. So I want to mention the name of a lady to you as an example of the worst case scenario. This is the most horrible thing in society that most people imagine could happen. A woman would get raped and become pregnant. Now what's she going to do with this child that she didn't want? Her name is Jennifer Christie. Some of you might know her. You might have seen some of her videos and things. I really encourage you to look at her written testimony, look at her videos. She's a person who conceived after being raped. And she tells the horrible story, all the trauma she went through, her medical condition. She was severely beaten. This was a serial rapist that attacked her, and most of the women that he attacked, he murdered. So she was one of the ones that survived. Anyway, according to modern society, this is the end of this woman's life. This is the end of everything. She's lost it all. There's no hope. She's destined to her life being destroyed by this traumatic event. But what actually happens, if you read her story, is that she overcame and she became an example of triumph. She didn't go down the path of weakness. She went down the path of strength and resilience and overcoming. She had a husband that was very supportive, and they took the position that this child has done nothing wrong, and this child is part of the healing process. This child is a blessing, not a curse, and through this child, I'm going to walk through this healing process. And she tells her testimony, and that's exactly what happened. And people ask her the question, well, how does it feel to be raising a rapist child? She says, I don't know. I don't have any rapist children. They're all my own. You know? And that was the attitude her husband took too. Anyway, it's just an example of how these situations that we think couldn't be any worse, they're going to lead to this total destruction, actually can turn out the other way if she had somebody to talk through this with. And she had her husband, and he was very supportive. And he's like, no, it's fine, we'll get through this. And he talked her through it, he walked her through it, and together, now she's one of the biggest pro-life voices, and she's going around and telling people, I'm living this out. I was raped, I did conceive, we had the child is part of my healing, and it's a good thing. And so this is a very, in my mind, very, very powerful lesson to our society today, exactly about trauma. So, are we approachable parents? Are we there for our children in adversity? Are we the safe one that they can tell about? If we're not, why are we not? Well, there's some challenges here. When Adam and Eve sinned, God was the perfect parent per se, but they didn't go to him, did they? They ran and hid. So you could see they found out they were naked. That was traumatic. What was their reflex? Freeze. They went and hid. They're afraid. They went and hid. They're not thinking now. They're reacting out of their survival mind. We've got to get away from God. He's not safe. What does God do? He comes looking for them. So you already have this naturally at play in your child, especially if the trauma that happens to them is something sinful that they've done. They're going to not want to be around you. They're not going to want you to know. So if children experience trauma related to their misdeeds, they will often avoid us rather than come to us. So what does God do in those situations? He goes looking for them. He goes finds them. But what we notice in the story of God looking for Adam and Eve, there's no anger on God's part. There's zero anger in the story. God says to them, did you eat of the tree which I told you not to eat of? Because of our human weakness, we imagine God saying in this big, angry tone of voice, you know, but that's not necessarily implied. He could have said it in a very loving, gentle way. What? You mean you ate of that tree that I told you not to eat of? We assume the anger's there. It's not necessarily there. And so, anger, we've got to deal with this one because this is a big one. When children do something wrong or they have a trauma and the response of the parent is anger, that puts up a huge barrier because the next time the child goes through that experience, they're saying, whoa, I'll never talk to them about it because last time they got this angry. If they find out about this one, they might even get more angry. And so what is our reaction when our children do wrong and hide it, or they have some traumatic thing happen that maybe cost us money, or we had a loss, or whatever? The children need to know that our response is not going to be one of anger. They need to have that already established before their trauma, so that when they get to the trauma, they realize, oh, I can talk to my parents about this. So if we've already established a pattern of dealing with our children in anger, we can resolve that by going back and saying, hey, I'm sorry, it's not right for me to be angry. We can humble ourselves, we can ask forgiveness, and then we can start building a track record. And they're going to have to see that, because when we get angry, the children no longer feel safe, they don't trust us, so we're going to have to rebuild that trust back. And that's hard to do, but it can be done. And so to be an approachable parent, we have to do what it says here in James, where it says we've got this list of characteristics, and I'll go through these and then we'll close. James is telling us what it looks like to be this approachable person. And he's saying, first of all, it's pure. So let's think of purity this way. You have a sincere desire to help. You have a pure desire to help your child. There's no conflict of interest. There's no hidden agenda. And when your child does something wrong, you're not judgmental. You're admitting, yes, you did wrong. But just like God with Adam and Eve, there was no scolding, there was no berating, there was no humiliating. There was saying, okay, you ate of the tree, this is going to be your punishment. But you can dish out the punishment in the right attitude, where you're not judging and you're not condemning. And that's the way God was. So we want to be pure in our desire to help the child. Peaceable, no contention, no anger. Gentle. So gentle is power under control. You have all this power and authority as the parent, but if you use it too much, you're going to drive the child away, and they're going to have doubts about whether or not they can come to you. So we have the authority, we have the jurisdiction, we have the biblical backing. Yes, children, honor your parents, submit to your parents and everything, but our job is to be gentle, just like God was with Adam and Eve when the child has done something wrong or experienced trauma. So we want to respond responsibly and not let our power be out of control. Gentle and easy to be entreated. So we're going to work on being agreeable instead of disagreeable. We're going to work on negotiating instead of not negotiating. When Cain killed his brother, God gave Cain a punishment, and Cain said, God, my punishment is bigger than I can bear. God negotiated with Cain. He said, okay, I'm going to put a mark on you so that anybody finding you won't kill you. So as parents, instead of setting ourselves up as this firm wall that can't be negotiated with and there's no flexibility, we need to learn to be easy to be entreated. And full of mercy. What is mercy? Mercy is giving somebody less punishment than they deserve. So you tell your child, well, I should ground you and keep you in your room for 3 weeks, but I'll just do 3 days because I'm being merciful. I'm going to give you less punishment than you deserve. Good fruits. This is the prior evidence on our life that we're a good person. Proof that we're a reasonable, good person to deal with. They can see that from how we've lived in the past. And without partiality. So this is talking about being fair, being just, no respect of persons. If they've done wrong, call it what it is, wrong. If there's a disagreement between two, no favoritism, no pointing, picking one over the other, but everything's got to be fair and just. And then without hypocrisy, not two-faced. We don't want to be parents who are telling our children, well, you can't do this, and then they see us doing it. Okay, so that's not going to be very attractive to a child when they go through trauma and they realize, well, my parent doesn't let me do it, but they do it. It's very discouraging. So we should be coveting this position of the safe adult in our child's minds, and we should cultivate that with all the skill we have. If our children don't feel comfortable coming to us, then we should do something one step further. We should say, okay, look, when you're going to have trouble in life, you're going to have difficulties, you're going to have trauma. If you don't feel safe coming to me, I want you to know there's other people you can go to. Now that's going to hurt as a parent emotionally, because we want that position. We want to be there for them. But they might have a grandparent they feel closer to, or an uncle, or a brother, or a sister, or a pastor, or a Sunday school teacher. And so we don't want to close the door on that out of jealousy in our own parental emotions. We want to say, look, the pain I'm going to experience as a parent if my child doesn't go for help when they have trauma is greater than the pain I'm going to experience if I let them go talk to somebody else. So it's kind of, there is going to be pain in saying, okay, you're my son, you're my daughter, you don't want to talk to me, accept that hurts, but at least go talk to somebody. Find somebody that you can talk to. And so we've got to be willing to go ahead and say, that's not my choice, that's not my first choice. But for your sake, because I love you, I want you to go down that road. So help the child have a backup plan. Say, or if you say, what if there's a sudden accident and you're both gone, and you and your wife are gone suddenly, and then there's these children that are orphaned? Do you want them to be left with you were the only person in their life that they felt safe talking to? You need to have other people and say, well, your uncle, if mother and I suddenly die for some reason, you could go to this uncle or this aunt or this grandparent, whoever. So we need to back the children up and make sure that they have options when it comes to finding safe people to talk to. Sometimes they might have a situation we can't be there for some reason, even if we're still alive. And so let's think about love. What is real love? A poorly informed, shallow love is to try to protect my child from all adversity. A well-informed, mature love is to allow adversity to come to that child and be there for them as a safe, qualified listener to help them through it. How many children have had terrible adversity and never talked to anybody about it their entire life? How many people have become wrecks as humans because they lacked one safe person to talk to? How much destruction has fallen upon humanity because we haven't done the job of being the listening ear for each other? So love is listening. Love is saying, I never had anybody to talk to, but I'm going to be that person for you. And this brings us to one of our final points. Sometimes parents have never had that person to talk to in their life. Many parents have trauma that they went through in their youth. They've never gotten it out. They've never said it to anybody. And so sometimes parents want to be this for their child, but they're still reeling from the effects of what they went through. Okay? So I talked to Pastor Jonathan Wilson about these camps, and he said, Tim, this is what pastors have always done. This is nothing new. Pastors have always been this for people in their church, somebody they could come and talk to. Some people call it inner healing. It doesn't matter what we call it. All of us need this. If we've got stuff in our life that we've never been able to get out, never had anybody to talk to, we need to pray and ask God, help me find that person. God is willing to be that person, but He also wants us to have other humans. There's many verses in the Psalms. It talks about trusting God and pouring out your heart before Him. Go to God and just let it out. Tell Him how you feel, what it's like. And you can be honest. I had a friend, I'll tell you this story. He was a worldly man, an ungodly man, but he got saved, and he moved to Kentucky and he started growing alfalfa. And I don't know if you've ever grown alfalfa, but you try to make alfalfa hay, and the last thing you want is for it to rain on your alfalfa hay, because you can't sell that because it's not green anymore. And these horse buyers would pay, $7, $8, $10 a bale for this really good green alfalfa hay. But if it gets rained on, they don't want to pay for it at all. And so he's down there growing this alfalfa hay, and he's struggling in his relationship with God. And he'd be out there making his hay and watching the thundercloud come. And his wife told me, she said, I used to watch him from the kitchen, and I'd wonder what he was going to do. And here comes the storm, and God let it rain on his hay. He said he would stand out there and shout and make fists and shout and tell God what he thought, for letting it rain on his hay. Because, God obviously could have made the storm go the other way and not rain on his hay. And she said one day, same thing was happening again. Here comes the alfalfa, green and dry and ready to bale, and here comes the storm. And she said she saw him fall on his knees and bow his head and worship the Lord. And she saw that man break and just let go and let God. And it was okay for him to be angry at God. It was okay for him to raise his fist. It was okay for him to shout. God would rather we be honest, then He can deal with us. If we're not willing to be honest, He can't help us. And so it's good no matter what we feel, even if it's ugly. We can go to God, we can pour it out. A lot of times we just stuff it down, and then it erupts on our children. And they didn't do anything to deserve it. There's all this other stuff brewing in there, and we're angry and we're upset. Children do something and boom, they get hit with this flood of anger. But it's got nothing to do with the child. It's because we've got this unresolved trauma in our own life. So God wants us to be that person for us, but He wants us to have each other. So most of the time we're not going to need professional help. If we can find another Christian who'll be willing to listen to us. And as it says here in James, we're going to finish here. Very important. Confess your faults one to another and pray for one another that you might be healed. Okay? This confession involves praying. So remember this when you're working with children. This is a very big part of helping the child get closure. So the child comes to you, they've done something wrong or they've not done something wrong, but they're telling you about their trouble, their trauma, you close that session by praying for the child. Mentally, they need something to close that door, to seal that event, to help it move into the past. So we don't just let them tell and then say, okay, you're going to be fine now. Sometimes a person, once they get it off their chest, we say, once they tell about what happened, they feel so good and they're so happy because they're relieved of this burden that they're ready just to go off and face life again. But we have to be wise enough to say, hey, wait a minute, I know you feel good, but let's close this with prayer. Let me pray for you that you'll be healed. We don't want to skip that step. So if you're confessing something to somebody, telling about your trouble, and they forget to pray for you, you've got to remind them and say, hey, wait a minute, we need to close this with prayer. You pray for me. If you're the person listening to the confession, then you need to be on your guard and make sure you don't let that slip through. It's very easy for these talk sessions not to be closed with prayer, and I think that gives the enemy a chance to come back in. So just remember that tip with your children or with anyone else. So conclusion is, one of our primary parenting tools and skills is to become a skilled listener and a qualified, safe person in our child's estimation, so that they feel free to choose us when they're thinking about who's my safe person I can tell my troubles to. It's a very simple skill, it's a very biblical skill, but it can make the difference between our children being weakened and destroyed by trauma or becoming stronger and overcoming it. So let's renew our commitment to correcting whatever is out of order in our life so that we can become these approachable parents like God wants us to. So I wish that for you. I wish that for me, that we would be those safe, approachable people for our children and for one another. So let's pray. Lord, I thank you for how wonderful your word is, that no matter what subject we look into, we find so much wisdom in your word. And for this trauma and psychology, Lord, we thank you that you've already told us very detailed, very specific, how we can help others resolve these things, and especially for our children. So, Lord, it's a difficult age to be parenting in. There's so much going on. There's so much negative. But we pray that you would give us the wisdom to be parents that don't try to endlessly protect our children from all adversity, but know enough wisdom to let them be exposed and to manage it in a safe way. Lord, we pray that you would help us, especially those of us who've never had somebody to talk to find those people, and that we would be able to resolve our own issues and be available to our children and be approachable. Lord, we pray that our children would not be weakened or destroyed by the trauma that they go through, but that they would be stronger. It would push them to you, and it would push them to faith, and it would push them to be better people. And so we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.